James and Claire Matthews seemed like the perfect couple, their 30-year marriage built on a foundation of trust and shared dreams. But when Claire stumbled upon a single text message on James's phone, everything she thought she knew shattered. What she uncovered was a betrayal so deep, it would lead to a confrontation that neither she nor the woman who had unknowingly become part of her husband's secret life would ever forget. For over 3 decades, James and Claire Matthews seemed like the perfect couple. They had built a life together that many would have envied. James, a successful businessman, was known in their town for his sharp mind and charm, while Claire, his devoted wife, was admired for her grace and dedication to their family. They had 2 children, both now grown, and together they had created a picture-perfect suburban home that everyone admired. From the outside, it looked like nothing could ever go wrong. Their marriage, by all accounts, was the epitome of stability. James had a demanding job that kept him busy, but Claire, who had been a stay-at-home mother for many years, was the anchor of the family. She took care of the home, managed the household finances, and supported James's career in every way she could. They had settled into a comfortable routine, weekend outings, quiet dinners, and moments of laughter shared between the 2 of them. To the outside world, they were the definition of contentment. Even their closest friends admired how well they seemed to balance their work, family, and personal lives. But as the years went on, small changes began to appear. Claire didn't notice at first, chalking it up to the usual bumps that come with any long-term relationship. James had always been a bit of a workaholic, often staying late at the office or going on business trips. But over time, the late nights started to stretch longer. There were moments when he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere even when he was physically present. At first, Claire attributed it to stress. He had always been ambitious, and the pressures of his work could easily explain his growing absences. Still, there were things that began to gnaw at her. She started noticing his phone buzzing more frequently, but he would always silence it or leave the room when it rang. At first, she thought it was just the demands of his business, but when the calls began to come at odd hours, late at night or early in the morning, she began to feel uneasy. There were also the little things. His sudden interest in his appearance, a new cologne that he'd never worn before, and the way he seemed to check his reflection more often before leaving the house. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a slow-growing sense of doubt in Claire's mind. She tried to push these thoughts away, telling herself that her imagination was running wild. After all, they had been married for so long. Their children were grown, and they were at a stage in life where they should be enjoying the fruits of their hard work. They had a beautiful home, good friends, and a stable life together. Surely she thought it was just a rough patch, something that many couples go through. But with each passing day, her doubts grew. One evening, as James prepared for another business dinner, Claire's suspicion reached a tipping point. She had never been the type to snoop or pry into his things, but something felt different this time. When James left, she found herself standing in front of his dresser drawer, staring at the phone that lay on the bedside table. The temptation was unbearable. She told herself she just needed to check if everything was as it seemed, that there was no harm in just looking once. With trembling hands, she picked up his phone and unlocked it. What she found sent a shockwave through her entire body. There in plain sight was a message from someone named Lori that read, "I can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you so much." The words burned through Claire's chest, a cold wave of betrayal crashing over her. She felt her heart race as her mind struggled to process the reality of what she had just discovered. For a moment, she was paralyzed. Her marriage, her life, everything she thought she knew seemed to shatter in an instant. It wasn't just the message itself that struck her so deeply. It was the realization that her husband, the man she had spent over 30 years with, had been hiding this from her. The facade of their perfect life was just that, a facade. There was someone else, someone who had been sharing the intimacy that Claire thought was still hers alone to have with James. The trust she had placed in him was no longer something she could take for granted. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage suddenly felt like a lie. In that moment, Claire was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: disbelief, anger, hurt, and something far darker. But more than anything, she was determined to find out the truth. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about the years of deception, the moments she had missed, the things she had overlooked. And now, the most important thing was to confront it all, head-on. The discovery of the text message from Lori left Claire in a state of shock, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she had just uncovered. She couldn't understand how James could have kept this secret for so long, how he had been able to hide an affair right under her nose for 2 entire years. Her hands trembled as she put the phone back down on the nightstand, a strange numbness settling over her. The life she had known, the life she had worked so hard to build, suddenly felt like it was crumbling. But Claire wasn't the type to act on impulse. She wasn't going to confront James immediately, not yet. She needed to understand more. For the next few days, Claire's emotions were a tangled mess of anger and disbelief. She could no longer look at James the same way. Every conversation, every gesture, seemed like a lie, a thin veil covering the truth she had just uncovered. Claire knew that this wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment on his part. This was an ongoing betrayal. The affair wasn't a fleeting mistake. It was a calculated choice he had been making over a long period of time. What stung the most was not just the act of infidelity itself, but the realization that James had never once considered telling her the truth. He had been living a double life, a life she had never suspected. The more Claire thought about it, the more questions piled up. Who was Lori? What did she have that Claire didn't? Had James ever truly loved her, or had she just been a convenience for him? As the days passed, Claire found herself consumed by these thoughts. She couldn't focus on anything else. The memories of their past seemed tainted now, every tender moment they had shared colored by the shadow of this affair. How had she been so blind? How had she failed to see the signs? With a quiet resolve, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. She began by looking through James's phone once more, this time more methodically. She searched through his text messages, emails, and even his call history. Each new discovery only added to the weight of the betrayal. She found texts between James and Lori that were filled with flirtations and promises to see each other soon. There were plans for secret meetings, messages of affection, and even discussions about future getaways. It was clear that their connection was much deeper than just a brief fling. James had been in a full-fledged relationship with this woman. Claire's next step was to learn more about Lori. At first, she had no idea who she was, but with the information she had gathered from James's phone, she was able to track down Lori's social media profiles. She was surprised to discover that Lori wasn't some random woman. In fact, she was someone with a life of her own. A career, a family, friends, everything that Claire had once taken for granted. Lori appeared to have no idea that James was married. She wasn't some predatory lover looking to tear apart a family, at least not intentionally. In fact, it seemed as if Lori believed James was single. Claire's anger shifted slightly as she realized that Lori had been just as much a victim of James's lies as she had been. But that did little to ease the pain Claire felt. In some ways, it made the betrayal even worse. Not only had James been lying to her, but he had also been lying to Lori. He had been playing both women, giving them each a false version of himself while secretly keeping them apart. It was a cruel game, and now Claire was stuck in the middle of it. The more Claire learned, the more she understood just how deep this deception went. James had built an entire life with Lori, one that she had never even known about, and all the while, he had been lying to Claire, living a life of secrecy. The woman who had once trusted him with everything now found herself questioning everything. Her marriage, her self-worth, and the man she had built a life with. Claire knew she couldn't let this go. She couldn't let James continue to lie to her, to them both. She had to confront him, had to face the truth of the situation head on. But there was a cold, calculating part of her now. She wasn't just going to ask questions or demand answers. No. She would make him feel the weight of his choices. Claire knew that the life they had shared was over. But what came next was still uncertain. One thing, however, was clear. She wasn't going to let this betrayal go unpunished. For the next few days, Claire's determination grew stronger. Her emotions, anger, betrayal, disbelief, had hardened into something else. A quiet, calculated resolve. The more she discovered, the more she realized that this wasn't just about confronting James and ending their marriage. This was about regaining control of her own life, about facing the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. It was also about understanding the full extent of the betrayal, not just the affair itself, but the entire web of lies that James had woven around her. With every passing hour, Claire's focus sharpened. She had already learned so much. Laurie's full name, where she lived, even her job and her social connections. There was something about Laurie that had Claire on edge. It wasn't just the fact that Laurie had been with James behind her back, but the nagging feeling that Laurie had no idea how deep the deception went. As Claire continued to dig, she found a troubling detail. Laurie didn't seem to have any idea that James was married. Every conversation, every text message, seemed to suggest that Laurie genuinely believed James when he said he was living a life without attachments. It was in that moment that Claire's anger began to shift. Initially, she had been furious at Laurie, but now she couldn't help but feel pity. Laurie had been played just as much as she had. James had been a master manipulator, keeping both women in the dark while simultaneously stringing them along. But even as pity crept into her heart, Claire's mind was still focused on one thing: revenge. Claire began to plan, taking every piece of information she had gathered and mapping out what she could do with it. There was no question that James had crossed a line, and there was no going back from that. But she didn't want just to walk away from the wreckage. She wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done. The idea of confronting him directly, of calling him out on his lies and making him face the destruction he had caused, was appealing. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply divorce him and move on. Claire had already invested 30 years into this marriage, and she wasn't about to let him get away with destroying it without paying a price. That's when she came up with the plan. She would confront James, not alone, but with Laurie in the picture. Claire had learned enough to know where Laurie lived, and after several days of contemplating, she made the decision to visit her. It was a move that surprised even her. Up until that point, Claire had always been the one who stayed behind the scenes, taking care of the home and family while James played the role of the successful businessman. But now, she was stepping into the forefront of her own life, taking charge in a way that she never had before. The night before the confrontation, Claire barely slept. Her mind was racing with thoughts of how it would unfold, what she would say to Laurie, and how she would handle James's inevitable lies. She imagined all the possible scenarios, each one more dramatic than the last. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't just about confronting James or Laurie. It was about reclaiming her dignity and making sure that her husband would never be able to look her in the eye again without feeling the guilt of his actions. The next morning, Claire drove to Laurie's house. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel, and her heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was risky. She could never be sure how Laurie would react, whether she would be angry, defensive, or surprised. But Claire felt a strange calmness. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was empowered. She was taking control of a situation that had been thrust upon her, and no matter what happened next, she would not back down. When she arrived at Lori's house, the reality of the moment hit her. This was it. The moment that everything would change. She stood outside the door for a moment, gathering her thoughts, trying to steady her breath. She had no idea how Lori would respond to the truth, but Claire knew that this confrontation needed to happen. She couldn't let the affair go on, couldn't let her husband continue to tear apart everything they had built. She had to put an end to the lies. With a deep breath, Claire rang the doorbell, her finger trembling slightly. She didn't know it then, but this moment would mark the beginning of a long, dark journey, and while it might have seemed like an end, it would actually lead to something much more twisted than she could have ever imagined. When Lori answered the door, Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had imagined this moment countless times in the past few days, but now that it was real, it felt strangely surreal. Standing in front of her was the woman who had been sharing her husband's life, the woman who had unknowingly become the instrument of Claire's heartbreak. The tension was palpable, thick in the air as Claire's mind raced with the many ways this encounter could go. Lori looked startled at first, taking a moment to process the sight of the woman standing on her doorstep. Her face shifted from confusion to cautious recognition as Claire's eyes locked with hers. She wasn't exactly what Claire had expected. Lori was attractive, but not in a way that made Claire feel more threatened. Instead, she felt a deep sense of sorrow, not just for herself, but for this woman who had been lied to just as much as Claire had been. For a brief moment, there was silence between them, neither woman speaking. Claire could feel the weight of the moment, the truth hanging in the air, about to shatter whatever illusions both of them had been living under. Finally, Claire broke the silence, her voice cool and steady, though her hands were trembling by her sides. "I'm Claire Matthews," she said. "I'm James's wife." Lori's face shifted, her eyes widening in shock. There was no anger, no accusation, just disbelief. Claire watched her carefully, waiting for a response, but Lori just stood there for a long moment, processing the information. It was as if the ground beneath her had suddenly been yanked away. "I didn't know," Lori whispered, her voice shaking. "I thought he was single." The words hit Claire harder than she expected. This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal of both women. James had convinced Lori that he was free, that there was no one else in his life. She had been living under the same illusion that Claire had been, albeit in a different form. The sadness in Lori's voice almost made Claire feel guilty, but she quickly squashed that emotion. This was not about pity. It was about reclaiming her own sense of control and justice. Claire nodded slowly, taking in Lori's reaction. It seemed genuine. Lori hadn't been in on the lies, at least not directly. But that didn't make the situation any less painful. If anything, it only made it more complicated. The feeling of being so utterly deceived, of having your entire life upended by someone else's choices, was something neither of them deserved. "You've been with him for 2 years, haven't you?" Claire asked, her voice low but firm. She wasn't angry with Lori. Not really, but she needed to know everything. She needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal. "He's been lying to both of us." Lori seemed to collapse inwardly, the shock of the revelation settling deeper into her consciousness. She looked down, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of Claire's words had physically affected her. "I had no idea," Lori whispered again, her voice now full of regret. "He told me he was divorced, that he'd been single for a long time." Claire's eyes narrowed. The manipulation James had executed was almost too calculated. He had carefully crafted 2 separate lives, keeping them both in the dark. His deception had been masterful, And for a moment Claire felt a sense of disgust at how easily he had fooled her, how deeply he had embedded himself into Laurie's life. "I'm sure you didn't," Claire said, her tone softening for a brief moment, though the sting of betrayal still clouded her thoughts. "But he's been lying to both of us. And now I have to figure out what to do with this." Laurie looked up at Claire, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and guilt. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Claire took a deep breath. She hadn't fully worked that out yet. The rage that had initially burned through her had dulled into a more calculated coldness. She wasn't sure if she wanted revenge, closure, or simply to be rid of the man who had turned her world upside down. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going to end quietly. "I don't know yet," Claire said, her voice steady. "But this ends today." Laurie nodded slowly as if accepting some unspoken truth. She didn't argue, didn't try to defend herself or James. She simply stood there, her face filled with the kind of sorrow that comes from realizing you have been complicit in something much larger than you ever understood. The silence between them hung heavily, but Claire knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. She had learned what she needed to know. Now the real confrontation awaited, when James would return home and be forced to face the consequences of his actions. And no matter how this situation unfolded, Claire knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same again. The day after Claire's meeting with Laurie, everything felt different. The calmness that had settled over her during the confrontation with the other woman had now given way to an even stronger resolve. She had learned what she needed to know, and now, the most difficult part awaited her. Confronting James. She knew he would be home soon, and when he arrived, the entire truth would come crashing down on him. Claire's mind was sharp, her emotions steady as she moved around the house, preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of her life. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way she had been when she first found the text message or when she had discovered the depth of the affair. Now she was simply focused on making James face what he had done. She had spent 30 years with him, and while their marriage may have seemed perfect to the outside world, Claire knew better now. The perfect marriage had always been a lie. James's car pulled into the driveway, the sound of the engine echoing through the quiet house. Claire didn't hesitate. She walked toward the living room and stood near the front window, waiting for him to enter. When the door opened, James stepped inside, briefly pausing to hang his jacket on the coat rack. He glanced up at Claire, offering her a smile that in that moment felt more like a mask than anything genuine. "Hey, Claire," he said casually, not yet aware of the storm that was about to hit. Without saying a word, Claire motioned for him to sit down. Her voice was cool but firm when she spoke. "We need to talk." James's smile faltered slightly, his brow furrowing. "About what?" he asked, still unaware of how much Claire already knew. "About you and Laurie," Claire replied, the words coming out with a sharpness that surprised even her. "About the 2 years you've been lying to me, hiding this affair behind my back." James went pale, his mouth opening as though he were searching for the right words to say, but there were none. Claire had already stripped away the facade, exposing everything he had worked so hard to hide. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, though the tension in his voice betrayed the lie. Claire wasn't interested in his excuses. She didn't want to hear him try to justify his actions, or offer the same tired excuses that men like him often used. She had heard enough of those over the years, things like, "It didn't mean anything," or "It was a mistake." No, this wasn't a mistake. This was a conscious choice, repeated over and over again, and Claire wasn't going to let him get away with it. "I met her, James," Claire continued, her eyes locking onto his. "I went to her house. She didn't know about me. She thought you were single. She believed your lies just like I did." James's face twisted with a mixture of guilt and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He could see that Claire wasn't backing down. This wasn't going to be a typical confrontation where he could talk his way out of things. This time, Claire was in control. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low but steady. "You've destroyed everything. You've lied to me, to her, and worst of all, you've lied to yourself." James looked away, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his guilt was starting to sink in. But Claire wasn't finished yet. This wasn't just about him facing the consequences. It was about Claire making a choice, about taking back control of her own life. She had spent so many years living in the shadow of his lies. But now, she was standing in the light, finally seeing the truth for what it was. "You don't get to play both sides anymore," Claire continued. "You don't get to live a double life and pretend that everything is fine. This ends today, James. You can't keep stringing me along. You've destroyed my trust, and now you're going to have to deal with the consequences." There was a long silence between them. James's face had lost all its usual bravado. He had always been the one with the power, the one who made the decisions, but now the power had shifted. Claire was no longer the woman who had silently stood by, watching her life unravel. She was taking control. "I'll leave," James finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'll move out." Claire nodded slowly. She wasn't surprised by his response. It was exactly what she expected. James had always been the one to run when things got tough, always the one to avoid facing the real issues. But this time, there was no running. There was no pretending. "You'll leave, but you won't get away with this," Claire said coldly. "Not without facing the truth. And neither will Lori. This is not just about you and me. It's about everything you've destroyed." James didn't respond. He simply stood up, his face a mask of guilt and resignation. Claire watched him silently as he walked toward the door, knowing that this would be the last time she ever saw him the same way. Their marriage, their life together, was over. And while the pain of betrayal still lingered, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. As James left the house, Claire stood in the doorway watching him go. She wasn't sure what her future held, but one thing was certain. She would no longer let him define her. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like she was finally in control of her own story.